and talk a little bit and have a conversation about work and the changing nature of work, because I got to sneak out of work in order to be here and come up from San Ramon. A second reason was that we found out yesterday at my job that one of the Saudi royalty was going to be visiting my lab to be seeing the demos that I'm going to talk to a little bit about to you later today. And so this helped me avoid having to wear a suit for the second time since I moved to Northern California. So I have not quite a perfect record, because the last time was when they came, so it was nice to get around that. Now what I'm going to do today is not give you a finished portrait of how work is changing in the industrial internet. We haven't been around that long, we're just getting started. So we're still at the stage of kind of early sketches and paint on the canvas of what this research area is about. Rather, what I want to do is kind of get you all interested in or aware of where we see some interesting opportunities. In the convergence of information sciences, human-computer interaction, and this domain of industry and how the digital world is impacting industry, which is what brought me down here and brought me to GE and GE Global Research to set up the labs that we're working with. We've been around about a year and a half, which isn't very long. I took over the set of labs about 9 months ago, and that's when we started to shape this vision. Now, most of my career, which goes back to Bell Labs, I started there in 1980, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the talk, has been about information workers and consumers. I mean, most of what we spend our time thinking about is that world. One of the things that it's important to remember is when you look at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics is actually the information worker space is not a very big space in the big scheme of things. Most people are the people who build these buildings and the buildings out there and create the roads and make the cars and make the planes and work on us in hospitals and supply services and sell stuff to us that other people make or grow or create or ship to us. That's the world of industry. And so the bottom line of what I'm going to talk to you about is this new opportunity where the digital world, the information world, is coming to that world, and we have an impact to really rethink and reshape that world as we're at this transition point into the next generation of our culture and society. And you'll see a little bit about where the business rationale for this comes from. So what I want to do is kind of talk about this world and how we got there and some of the implications, and then some of the things that we're starting to explore, some of the areas that we think are interesting. Now, a lot of people are writing and already feeling this change of what work is like as the digital world spreads out, right? People are seeing this huge change, and it's being compared to the Industrial Revolution. And you think of that revolution, and sort of the last 150 plus years, we've been in this industrial age following the agrarian age. And now as we're moving into this new data-like age, some people think of it as the age of the computer, or PC was talked about. Then it was the age of the internet. We're arguing a little bit in my world about the industrial internet and big data, Internet of Things, you see talked about. But it's really this digital, when you could take it over 20 years or 30 years that all this has been going on, it's the move to a digital age that's coming. Now, if you look back at each of those other times, and actually each major stage in society really, as new technologies come in, it hasn't really wiped out the previous technology or completely changed what went before it. It's an ecosystem. And everything sort of shifts around to find its new niche in the ecosystem. And so when we talk about work and how work is changing and is going to change going forward, where the interesting things are happening is as those interactions are happening, as that change is happening, as industry imposed itself on an agrarian world, opened up urban environment, both of those things started to play together. We're now bringing a virtual world on top of that and imagining and finding what are the new things that are enabled by that convergence of technologies. Now, when most of us think about work, we think sort of like modern times. It just feels so hard to get up in the morning and go to work every day, unless you're here at Berkeley. But those of us who have to drive down to San Ramon, it feels like this in the morning, especially if we're trying to beat traffic. Or like Metropolis, if you've seen Metropolis. But kind of at the core of those images, is this sort of industrial root, right? There's this touching a world of physical stuff, gears and wires and tubes and pipes and dirt, stuff that makes up industry. When I started again back at Bell Labs in '80, it was not unusual. In fact, almost every meeting I was in with a significant number of people sitting in a circle. I don't know about you when you were there, but many of us were missing digits on our fingers from industrial accidents. Don't to gross you all out, but it was just part of what happened when you worked in factories, especially before human factors and OSHA and all these other things started to come into place. It was an industrial, physical world that you engaged in. And what is happening now is really overlaid on this is kind of a digital sensibility. Everybody in this place is starting to experience what that virtual world is like. Now, as we think about what those changes are, one way to think about them is to go back to the Industrial Revolution. And the big change people talk about, sort of the enabler, the tipping point back then, was the introduction of steam as a new power source, right? People thought about bringing steam in, adding greater productivity, changing things, and there was a vision that people had. Jules Verne had, writers had, artists had, the inventors had. It wasn't necessarily this particular vision. This particular vision comes from the fact that my two daughters are into steampunk, and this image looks a lot better than the steampunk costume they made me, and then I have to wear every Christmas when we go over to the Victorian thing at the Cow Palace. But I wish I had this. One of the things that's sort of engaged in this imagery is that it's about empowering somebody in a way. I mean, there's sort of this vision of the things as you think about steampunk and as you thought about the vision, both good and evil as a literary technique or storyline. It's all about kind of bringing this technology and the things that this technology enabled. Now, as it happened, when it was first introduced, it looked a little bit more like this. And I love going to towns that have been rebuilt and restored and going into the factories. And my favorite part is all of these big leather belts everywhere. Right? And that's sort of the characteristic. And what it was really they had power often from horses or people or little kids or water. And what they did is they put steam in, and that enabled things to move faster, and then they could just power it with coal or wood or whatever. But one of the things that was interesting is when they did that, and they anticipated huge improvement in productivity, they didn't get it. There was an improvement, a physical improvement in an individual factory. But basically what they were doing was taking the things that people were doing anyway and giving a better power source to those things. And there was a cost of putting that power source in. And so when you look at some of the historical records, they didn't find the change until you started to rethink the way the enterprise ran and rethink the way businesses worked, assuming steam and other power sources that came through that period. And then when you thought about the assembly line, then out of that assembly line, you start to get this wave of effects moving through society, right? You got cars that anybody could afford. You got roads, because you needed the roads for the cars. The roads then got you out to new forms of recreation. They created new towns. Then there were new businesses. There was a way of getting goods to new places. Society changed as rethinking the environment and the enterprise based on what was enabled by a new technology. Now, not everything was perfect. A lot of jobs were really crappy. And that move from the satisfaction of being able to build an entire car yourself from just turning the crank on the same part over and over and over, that wasn't necessarily the best thing. But when you looked overall, the cost of goods came down, you saw enterprise grow, more people were employed, businesses were enhanced. I mean, that was sort of the power of the Industrial Revolution. And then, other cultural things happened and business things happened and so on. Well, then, the same thing, in a way, is the part that we're in now, right? And again, it's not that long to when I started my career, back in 1980. When I was in graduate school, I was still working on my thesis, running stat programs on a mainframe with stacks of cards. And in fact, typing my thesis with lots of carbon paper and trying not to make any mistakes, because then you had to redo the whole page. But what I did do as a graduate student, and which made me a big hero among the graduate students at Northwestern, was I bought a TRS-80 from Radio Shack, and I ran my experiments on the TRS-80, and I upgraded it from 16K to 64K, and so I was the tech guru among the graduate students at the time. It didn't take much to be a tech guru, fortunately, back then. But that was where the technology was. Then I went to Bell Labs. Bell Labs, we were still programming on the mainframe, still hauling the cards down. Still in our lab, we were programming in Octal on PDP-8s, paper tape, running paper tape. We did get a Xerox Star in, so we got the precursor of what became the Mac, started playing with that. And then you started to see personal computers coming in. You saw IBM, and then later, just before I left, was kind of mid-'80s when we got our Mac in. We were playing with our Mac and then doing experiments, comparing the two environments. There was a key here that I think was important. It was similar to STEAM. Part of this world was one of my former bosses, Bill Gates, and he had a vision, at least he articulated a vision for his company, which was to put a personal computer on every desk, right? And that's a little bit like back in the AT&T days, the notion of universal telephone service or universal communication. And that vision really has happened. What they did, whatever you think of all the other parts of Microsoft, what Microsoft enabled in putting computers everywhere has been a world-changing event. Now, it's a world-changing event that had a vision, but like STEAM, didn't necessarily come through and true in the way people think about it. Now, there were lots of different visions, sort of like that steampunk thing, right? This was one, in fact, created by Microsoft and by a friend of mine that was sort of faked up with plexiglass and so on. But there's sort of this notion of a digital world. Back in the early 90s, we were looking at Apple's Knowledge Navigator, right? And everybody was talking about, and it was sort of the same spirit of information anywhere, interacting in natural ways, portable information. Everybody had this vision, and computers were moving out everywhere. And there was, like with STEAM, a notion of, that people were talking about, and we went to a couple of workshops on it, called the productivity paradox. Productivity paradox was that computers were going on every desks everywhere, but you weren't seeing the business return for spending all that money on all that technology that was going out. And the reason was most of the time, it was just replacing my favorite IBM Selectric, right? It was just a really expensive typewriter, right, which had a remote printer, and you had a keyboard, and then you were looking at things, and then some other tools came in, but it was basically a really expensive typewriter. And this also gave me a good excuse to probably show you, among just a handful of people left in the world who have ever seen a memory drum, This is what was originally being used in my lab before I got the TRS-80. And what the memory drum was, I was in a cognitive psychology program then called Learning and Memory, and we were studying how cognition worked with what were then known as nonsense syllables. We now think of them as acronyms. And learning all about memory. And the way you did it was there was a cloth tape that went over this drum, which then, being the graduate assistant, I had to take and put in the selector typewriter and type long lists of nonsense syllables in, and then we would run it and have people sit there, and you'd run it at different rates, and you had a little window that opened and closed, things like that. Well, that was a perfect thing for a stupid computer with not very complex program on it. You were just replacing things that worked in the physical world. Now, when I, again, started at Bell Labs, part of what we were talking about back then was the notion of the paperless office. And that was kind of our vision back then. I mean, that was what, you're bringing these things in, everything is being digitized, you can do calculations, you can do typing, you can do editing, you can create documents. Why do you need paper anymore? Now, in fact, we probably haven't yet achieved the paperless office. In some places we're better, in others worse, but if you went to my house and you talked to my wife and she told you what weekends look like, it's about sorting piles of paper that I printed out from emails that came in that I didn't have time to read, and then I'm sorting into high priority, medium priority, and low priority, because I don't yet quite have the tools that make it work for me yet. And if anything, what's happened is I can now make an infinite number of copies or make it circulate to an infinite number of people because I don't have to work for carbon paper anymore, and then they have to print it out, and it just gets worse and worse. So we have a long ways to go in order to get to the paperless office vision. But that wasn't the thing that was really important. That wasn't the thing that has been important and is the change that's happening. Back then, one of the early things, VisiCalc, the spreadsheet, a new way of thinking about numbers and text and managing data and doing things that with the technologies before we couldn't do. There was hyperlinks in documents, and HyperCard for that matter, which let you jump from any piece of information to another piece of information. There was networking that came behind that so that information could be remote, right? You started to be able to build new kinds of experiences that weren't enabled before. And then you added the internet, you added the ability for anybody to do publishing, you started to create a web environment, you brought design in, you brought in a whole new set of capabilities, but the important thing was when enterprises started to be designed based on the new technology or set of technologies. And we're kind of in the middle of that right now. I mean, there was the first wave of .com, you know, all the startups and all the little businesses that were coming up that would lose money on each piece of thing that was sold, but try and make it up in volume, which doesn't work, as they found out. We're still in that. When I was up at Microsoft just before taking this job down here, I was working on cloud computing and the strategy for cloud computing. And part of what we were doing was doing research with startups in the Seattle area. And when we talked to them, part of what was interesting, they were like you, right? Coming out of school. And the venture capitalists were telling them, don't buy anything. You just need a desk someplace. You need a desk, you know, it could be at the coffee shop I was at before coming here. Don't invest any money in any servers or anything. Everything's available through Amazon, or you can get some level of free service even from Microsoft. You can start to build a business with like zero capital and then only buy stuff when you have to scale up. Well, that unleashes an incredible amount of creative power in a world of innovation where ideas bring value, right? And that in turn connects up when you think of the maker movement, you think of 3D printing, you think of all these new technologies that are coming behind all of these things. The world is starting to change and businesses are changing with them. One of the things you see, obviously, is little startups when you go over here that look very much like this, design studios. And over in San Ramon, about a year and a half ago when I started, there were about 100 of us. There's now 900 of us. We'll have 1,200 in about the next 3 months. We'll be up to 2,000 probably in the next year, 3,000 a couple of years after that. We've taken over this 5-story building and looking to take over the building next to it, and it all looks like a scaled version of this, right? All of the walls are whiteboards. You can write anywhere. You can write on the tables, you can write on the walls, you can write on the floor, you can write on the windows, you can write everywhere. The entire place is like living in a big brain, right? There's data, there's information, there's ideas. Now that makes DARPA nervous and some of the things that we might be doing otherwise when they come there and see that, but it's all out there, right? And what GE is doing is it's coming here to the Valley, and part of why they set us up in San Ramon. They're studying startups to see, how these 5-person, 10-person, 15-person groups are working. And then they're taking those methods, they're taking that process, they're taking that way of doing work, and they want to scale it up to GE's 350,000 doing industry. They want to drive culture change by taking the learnings of this new thing enabled by this new set of technologies to do something new. So when you look at what work is, you see discussions of it's more cognitively complex, and when you talk about people, the struggles of manufacturing in the US, and that people need to get smarter, they need to get trained. Partly they're getting retrained, not because everything is going overseas, but it's getting empowered by new technologies, and they need to deal with that combination. It's getting team-based and collaborative. What we have in this world of computers and networking and so on is it doesn't matter where you are, when you can be unbound by space and time. Now, at some point, many people in industry are touching still this physical world. They're touching the knobs and dials and cables and things that they're making. But technology is enabling them to organize in different ways. When I was at Microsoft, kind of an example, and still in the IT pro space, is just thinking about the growth and productivity that is enabled by this technology. So when I started at Microsoft, a typical system admin had somewhere around 10 to 20 computers that they needed to support. About the middle of the time I was there, that same admin was responsible for about 150. By the time I left, they were responsible for 1,000. And they expected that within the next 5 years, they'd be responsible for 10,000. Right? The same person. So they have to have a new set of tools, a new way of working, a new way of interacting with those technologies, visualizing what's going on with those technologies. It's about how you take the information and present the information to them. Same for the people out in the field who are, say, supporting jet engines, right? Or supporting power plants, or supporting CAT scans, or whatever. More dependent on technological competence. The driver clearly is productivity. Year over year over year is being driven by productivity. We're trying to squeeze out more with this technology and rethink businesses in order to take advantage of it to enable that technology. So what we've got is a kind of combination of this digital world meeting this physical world. And when we think about what we're enabling with the people we've got out there making the roads, making the jet engines, repairing the jet engines, doing all of these things, it's about taking this physical thing and this virtual thing and bringing them together and trying to drive something new out the other side. Now, the industrial internet. Part of what GE has been pushing is this notion of the industrial internet. Many companies are talking about it, Accenture and IBM, as the Internet of Things. it's all about the fact that we're enabling this kind of combination of digital and physical. The things that sit behind it we kind of organize into 3 pillars. One set of pillars is this notion of intelligent machines and sensors. Everything is smart, right? Everything is being wired in different ways with RFID tags. And in fact, many of the machines are getting computers in them. Intel is coming out with a new chip that has an entire operating system in a chip. So for about $1, for $5, you can put a board in, which is basically a computer, into anything that you want to put it in. Your car, I was down talking to one university out here on the West Coast, and they had deconstructed a car, and there's at least a half a dozen computers in there, and a network, and several wireless connections, which typically aren't secure. And so they were able to show that people remotely could shut your car off, unlock the car, start up the car, whether you're in it or not. And so they've been working with manufacturers to fix that. The computers, this wave of smart machines is coming in. It's there, right? Everything's smart. Well, with that smart machine, you have a wave of data that's coming with it. Actually, the Internet of Things, as they say, part of what, and you probably know this, there are more things connected to the Internet than there are people connected to the Internet, and the number of things is increasing a lot faster than the number of people. So it's just going to get worse. You're going to get more smarts, and they're going to all be networked, and they're going to be smart. They produce this huge amount of data. Our architect we were up meeting with Microsoft, and we were talking to them, a group of their folks working on, in their data science area, new tools for data scientists. He's saying, we use 1% of the data we have 1% of the data we could have, and the data is increasing like 10 times every year, right? Mark Zuckerberg has said something similar. I think he's trying to come up with a Mark Zuckerberg law. Not quite catching on yet, but it's sort of in that spirit, this vast amount of data coming with those analytics. But then it has to connect to people. Now, one of the things about connecting to people that's really interesting and what has our research going and connected to this power is that for many of us, the vision of the 80s, sounds like Portlandia when I say it that way, vision for the 80s is coming true. That we have talked for many years, first of all, how to make ubiquitous computing, how to make everything alive. Well, the combination of the cloud connecting all of these smart machines, and there are holes here and there, but it's clear where we're going. We have ubiquitous computing. We're heading to ubiquitous computing. That means we can go from device to device. In my house, I've now got probably, between my daughter's computers and my wife's computers and my computers and our phones and all the other things, we probably have a couple of dozen computers in the house, right? And we use them all to get stuff done. We appropriate any device that makes sense for the context we're in or any combination of devices. That's also a unique design challenge. To design not just for one person and one device, design for one person in an unlimited number of devices. Design for a group of people in an unlimited number of devices working on the same thing together as a team. A different design challenge, but a tough one that we haven't really figured out. Then there's all of these devices. Now we talk about the Microsoft stack, we talk about the Google stack, we talk about the Apple stack. Maybe people don't talk about the Microsoft stack as much, but we talk about all of these different stacks. 20 years from now, half of the stacks are going to not matter either, and new stacks are going to be there, right? All kinds of, you guys are producing people who are inventing new environments, new sets of APIs, new ways of manufacturing that are all coming in and connecting to this cloud. And all of those things start to take advantage of gesture and speech and touch and audio and physical and vibration and location awareness and a whole wealth of technologies, some of which we haven't even thought of, right? Biometrics, all kinds of things. That means that this environment is getting to the other thing we've talked about doing. We've talked about designing things to fit the user. It's not only just designing it once to fit the user and making it static. We're now at a place where potentially that environment can shape itself to whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Now, I'm interested in accessibility, but part of what I'm interested in accessibility about is not only that, but it matters to all of us. If I'm out in bright sunlight, my vision has a deficit, right? If I'm in a noisy environment, my hearing has a deficit. If I'm driving and working with a computer, I'm trying to process multiple things. I have a cognitive deficit, right? We're at this place where theoretically the technology can connect to whatever you're trying to do. Well, along with these things, this is a really interesting change point for us.